It's Wednesday, it's 11:15 and we're live in Westminster. Joining me, former Conservative Cabinet Minister Andrea Leadsom, the SNP's Drew Hendry, the editor of the Daily Mirror, Alison Phillips, and LBC presenter Ian Dale. Today, will there be compromise on the Irish sea border checks? The EU's negotiator calls for the UK to stop acting alone.
Long-lasting solutions and not quick fixes, and this is the spirit of my mind, which I'm coming to London, which I hope I will find on the other side as well.
Will Cinderella go to the ball? Andrew Lloyd Webber says he'll risk arrest to reopen his theatres on June the 21st.
The reaction of the government, if they do stop us from going forward, is neither rational nor is it proportionate.
We don't want these restrictions to be in place a day longer than is necessary.
We'll hear from the Prime Minister and Keir Starmer. PMQs is live at midday. Also, first the police, then protesters. Now, as world leaders descend on Cornwall for the G7 summit, is the county ready? Let's start with the story you heard in the headlines. Andrew Lloyd Webber has said he will reopen his theatres without social distancing, come what may later this month, even if COVID restrictions aren't all lifted on June the 21st, as planned by the government. And he says, as you heard there, he's prepared to face arrest for going ahead with his plans in defiance of any potential delay. There it is on the front page of the Daily Telegraph. My question to all of you to start off the programme is, should he be applauded or booed for his statement of intent? Andrea?
I have every sympathy with him. I mean, so many people are so sick of lockdown. On the other hand, I would never advocate anybody breaking the law. So it is a real dilemma. But, you know, there is a balance to be struck. The government will be looking very carefully at this between the damage of people dying of COVID and the NHS being overwhelmed and the very real damage of continued lockdowns on people's mental health, on their businesses, on their general happiness. And so, you know, this is a juggling act.
Do you have some admiration for what he said then?
I do, yeah. I think, you know, he's standing and being counted. Of course I do, yes.
Would you go to one of his musicals, even if they were deemed illegal?
Of course not, because I've just said I don't advocate breaking the law, but I can't wait to go back to a legal theatre.
All right, note taken. Drew, would you applaud Andrew Lloyd Webber for what he's saying and advocating? He's going to go ahead, whatever.
Well, look, it's really difficult particularly for theatres just now and other businesses that have had to close down. My local theatre, the chief executive there, has said that they will open within the restrictions, within the limits they've got, but it's going to be really challenging. It's going to be really difficult, and there has to be ongoing engagement to make sure that, you know, as soon as it's safe to return to bigger audiences, to make them more viable, we do that. But in the meantime, I think it is really important that we're all doing our bit to make sure that we continue to make progress against the virus, continue to make sure that people are getting vaccinations. And I think it's something we should not be encouraging or applauding to say, let's just break the rules.
What about you, Ian? Do you applaud what Andrew Lloyd Webber has said? I mean, if you read on or listen to one of his interviews, he said his theatres just won't survive otherwise.
I think you've got to have sympathy with any business at the moment which has effectively been shut for the last 14, 15 months. It's been a terrible situation for many people, not just in the theatre industry, but throughout arts and culture and other businesses. But I don't think you're going to get much disagreement on the panel, Joe, here. You can't support somebody breaking the law. I mean, it's a publicity stunt. It's worked in that we're discussing it on the programme today, so it's a good bit of grandstanding. But, I mean, Andy Burnham, I think, described Andrew Lloyd Webber as a prima donna. Well, anybody who writes musicals will know all about prima donna-ish activity, but I do have every sympathy with him.
Right, but on that, I suppose the backdrop, even if it is a publicity stunt, Alison, is that there have been reports that the government is considering delaying that June the 21st reopening by a fortnight, possibly even up to a month.
Yes, I mean, obviously it's an incredibly difficult situation for them at the moment because, as with Andrew Lloyd Webber and businesses all over the country, there's a huge demand to get reopened and to get back to normal. We've got a story on the front page of the Mirror today that says 50,000 weddings will have to be postponed again if we don't reopen on June 21st. They've got that on the one side. But on the other side, we have got the concern about the rising number of cases, although have to remember numbers of hospitalisations are very, very low, numbers of deaths incredibly low. So it's this awful balancing act. I mean, Michael Gove said, didn't he, that if he was a betting man, he'd said that it would go ahead on June the 21st. And it looks like Boris Johnson might be taking it right up to the wire of Sunday night before he actually decides whether we go with the 21st or we hang on. If it's only another fortnight, I think probably even Andrew Lloyd Webber might be able to hang on to that. If it goes for another 4 weeks or it's another 4 weeks and another review, that's where I think people's patience is really going to wane.
Andrea, could you wear another 2 weeks, a delay?
I would not want to. I mean, I was just at a business in my constituency last week who've got, they had 700 staff. They furloughed almost all of them, brought them all back to deal with, they've got 9 weddings in July, and most of them have just immediately resigned because they've been on furlough, they've got other things to do. And these businesses can't survive. This is a vital period of time for so many in the sector. And, yeah, I do think that that balance is a very tricky one. So I would be very, very reluctant to see further lockdowns unless there is really credible evidence that people are becoming very ill and dying and the NHS is at risk again of being overwhelmed.
All right, let's talk about Northern Ireland, because the UK's Brexit Minister Lord Frost has been meeting his EU counterpart, Maros Sefcovic, today to discuss ways to reduce disruption at the Irish sea border. It's latest in a series of meetings. It's all because of the Northern Ireland Protocol, which is part of the Brexit deal that creates a trade border in the Irish Sea in order to prevent a hard border on the island of Ireland. It was agreed by the UK and EU in October 2019. It keeps Northern Ireland in the EU single market for goods, and it means that EU customs rules are enforced at its ports. But it has led to some delays, more bureaucracy, and it is more complicated. Now, a deadline is looming at the end of June when chilled meats, such as sausages, could be blocked from export from mainland Great Britain to Northern Ireland under the terms of the deal agreed by Boris Johnson in 2019. And there have been reports, as we discussed yesterday, that ministers could be considering unilaterally extending what's known as the grace period for those particular goods to stop there being checks. Andrea, whose responsibility is this to sort it out?
Well, it's clearly equally the responsibility of the UK and the EU. I would absolutely recommend that David Frost and Maros Sefcovic start their day with a nice hearty breakfast of great British sausages to get them off on the right footing.
Mischievous.
Yeah, possibly. But nevertheless, you know, it requires a common sense response. On the EU side, as I understand it, I'm no longer in government, but there have been multiple papers sent to the EU to propose ways of resolution.
These were terms agreed, though, of course, by the government and voted on by MPs like you.
Indeed, but there was still work in terms of resolving issues at the border still to be agreed, and those have clearly not been agreed to the UK and indeed to Northern Ireland's satisfaction, and that must be done as a priority. The EU needs to take a common sense approach.
Right.
Well, making sure that the Good Friday Agreement is respected is the absolute paramount thing here. We've got to make sure that the deal that the UK government signed up to is honoured with it. I think there does need to be an effort to de-escalate this on both sides from the EU and the UK. But we can't have the UK again looking to break international law. It's just not the right way to behave.
Right. I mean, unilaterally, that is what Maros Sefcovic is saying.
There isn't a question of breaking international law, as Drew says. That is not what this is about. This would be absolutely respecting the Good Friday Belfast Agreement that requires that nothing is done to damage the integrity of the power sharing agreement. And it is absolutely vital that the UK government and the EU respect that. And at the moment, what's happening at the border is not respecting that agreement.
Well, it's not respecting that agreement because the deal that was signed, the so-called oven-ready deal that we had from Boris Johnson's, turned out to be nothing of the the kind with this. And like I say, it is a time for de-escalating things, for looking for solutions here. But the one way to do it is not to break the agreements that are being put in place unilaterally. Even I was listening on the BBC this morning to the director of the Northern Ireland Retail Consortium, who said, yes, he wants these measures to be in place, but not in the way the UK government are doing them just now.
Right, well, I think that interview that Drew's referring to, Ian, was a man who is supplying items like cheese to hospitality in Northern Ireland. Has gone from a sort of 3 days of cheese being brought in from Great Britain to Northern Ireland to 12 days and filling in 8 forms. Is that what the government promised? Much more complicated bureaucracy when they signed up to this deal?
Well, clearly not. And clearly the Northern Ireland Protocol is not working. Drew is right, the government signed up to it. But when something isn't working from both points of view, and I think that is the case here, then you have to sit down and come to an agreement. And I agree with Drew to the extent that I think it is time to dial down the language. I think all of this stuff about the Great British Banger, well, it's as if Jim Hacker is coming to rescue things. I'm not sure that is particularly helpful. But we've been here before in negotiations with the EU. You have both sides indulging in brinkmanship, and then at the final hour they will come to an agreement. And I hope they do, because on the face of it, I think we can all agree, whether we voted Brexit or Remain, we can all agree that Northern Ireland does deserve to be treated the same way as the rest of the United Kingdom and be entitled to have the same goods. It's not as if our food standards in this country are at a lower level than the rest of the EU. In fact, in many ways, they're higher than the rest of the EU. So I think we ought to bear that in mind sometimes.
Well,
too.
Alison, do you bear that in mind?
Well, I think there's two issues. There's a point of principle, which is that this agreement was reached. And there's some talk now that perhaps Boris Johnson didn't realise that this could be a
well, David Frost says he underestimated. He was quoted as saying he was underestimated the impact.
I mean, if they didn't know, they should have known, and they did know. I think we all knew they did know. But at the time, the view was taken up that let's just get this over the line, and we'll worry about the consequences further down the road, which I think is possibly how Boris Johnson approaches a lot of his negotiations with life. I'll work out the detail later on. So now time's running out. We've got to the end of the month, and there's a lot of people saying, yeah, we've got to compromise. We've got to kind of with some kind of pragmatic solution. But now they need to actually do that rather than just sort of the grandstanding around saying that.
Right.
And I think it's now time for pragmatism because, as Ian said, it is the people in Northern Ireland who do deserve to be able to buy the products in their shops and to be able to get the service that they require, and for the exporters that are trying to get goods to them. So it really is time to kind of come up with some solution.
Right, but Drew... Sorry, Ian, go on.
Just bear in mind also that we've got a very delicate time approaching with the marching season. And I think it would be unconscionable if either side got to June the 30th and then something sort of dramatic happened, because it would inflame all of the feelings that we saw on the streets of Belfast and other towns in Northern Ireland only a few months ago. Now, that wasn't just to do with the Northern Ireland Protocol. There were many other factors at play here. But we all know that the situation can be very, very delicate in Northern Ireland. And I hope, from the EU point of view, that they bear that in mind too.
Right. Well, do you agree, Andrew, which will mean compromise on the part of the UK government? I mean, referring to Theresa May's former Chief of Staff, Gavin Barwell, who said it's pretty sure he thinks it's not true that the government underestimated the impact of the Northern Ireland Protocol on goods when it agreed to it. They knew it was a bad deal, but agreed to get Brexit done, intending to wriggle out of it later. That's pretty damning.
I don't agree with that assessment by Gavin. No, what my recollection of this is that we very clearly had the arrangement that certain goods would be subject to checks and that those would be agreed in principle at the time of the signing of the document and then would be agreed in detail following the signing of the document. So it was all understood that there would be further negotiations following the signing of the document. If you remember, the actual signing took place in a very constrained period of time. So I completely agree with all of your panellists who are saying we've got to absolutely respect Northern Ireland and its integrity, but at the same time the EU needs to appreciate that a sensible, pragmatic approach is necessary.
Is it a bit of a warning to you and the SNP when thinking about an independent Scotland, which you'd like to be in the EU, following EU rules, and a UK then would be out of the EU EU as it is now with its own rules, how could there be a frictionless trade across the border?
Well, of course, what we're talking about here just now is either one of two things. If you take Andrea's point of view, that the UK government left it too late.
Yeah, but hang on. What about my question to you?
Well, this is important for the context of your question. They either left it too late or they just signed up something to get it over the line. That's not the way the Scottish Government has ever approached any aspect of independence. In 2014, in the referendum then, we produced a white paper saying exactly what we would put forward to the Scottish public. That's not happened throughout Brexit, and that's something we would look to do before any referendum that's coming up in the future.
But you do accept, of course, that there would be, as the Institute for Government said, an Anglo-Scottish border would become a new external customs and regulatory frontier for the EU, and you can see the problems that have unfolded.
Well, of course, there are problems that have unfolded, but we've also been discussing exactly why those problems have unfolded, because there hasn't been the right engagement to make sure that the measures that are put in place are going to be workable. I don't believe that we would approach it, especially looking at the absolute burdock that the UK government have made of this. Well, I don't think we would approach it in the same way anyway, in any manner or form at all.
Joe, can I make one?
Yes, you can. Go ahead.
Point. If you look at what comes into the port of Dublin from around the world into the single market, 1% of those goods are checked. And these are coming from countries which don't have the food standards or other standards that we do. So I think they should be starting from there. If there's 1% going into the port of Dublin that are checked, why not 1% of the goods that come from Great Britain into Northern Ireland? I don't think anyone would necessarily object to that, would they?
Right, well, I don't know. I'll have to ask...
That is the point. That is the point, is that a pragmatic solution is required. What the EU have done is they've gone hardcore. Now, you might think that there was an element of kicking us because we've had the temerity to leave. That's how it looks to me as a Brexiteer. It is not a pragmatic solution at the moment, and it is driven by the EU's intransigence. They do need to take a pragmatic solution. But to your point that you were making to Drew, Joe, I think it's an extremely brave conclusion that Scotland would necessarily rejoin the EU. What would that say to Catalonia and Spain? Does Drew think that the EU? Does Drew think that the EU would welcome?
Well, just briefly, because we're going to
this is the kind of scare story that we hear time and time again about Catalonia. Is a completely different thing. Scotland as a country has been a country for 1,000 years as a nation. The commentators across the EU, MEPs, other elected members, are very open to the idea of Scotland joining the EU.
Over how long?
The idea, well, you only have to look at other countries that have joined the EU, like Estonia and so forth. That process can be quite rapid.
Scotland's economy would be
Scotland
years
already,
before it met
Scotland
the
already meets all the
requirements.
conditions for joining the EU. So, and of course, during the meantime, there are other stages like EFTA and so forth.
It doesn't have in its deficit, certainly. I know you want to dispute the figures, but listen, we're going to move on because we've got a lot to get through.
That's not the case either, by the way.
Well, as I say, you always dispute it, the SNP, when they come on the programme, but certainly the figures, and I think they're your own figures that say the deficit wouldn't actually meet the standards. I just want to get from Alison, because we're going to be talking about the G7 throughout the programme. President Biden is arriving, of course, for it. What role can he play, do you think, in finding a solution or a way forward in this?
Well, I think at this point, I think that pressure will be put upon the UK government to sort of really to go that extra mile, particularly as we know his connection with Ireland as well. And that, and I think Ian made a really good point about the marching season only just around the corner at the beginning of next month. And we've got 3 weeks until the end of this month. This has to be a priority because, as we know, we're talking about a really, really small issue here. But is the root of this problem the fact that the EU feel that the UK government are having one over on them by not staying true to what they signed up for?
All right.
Well, to be fair to Joe Biden, he's also said to the EU that they need to be less bureaucratic.
Yes, he has.
So, I mean, I think that's quite an important point to make, and because they are being overly bureaucratic, we can all see that.
Yeah.
All right, well, on that, let's go to Cornwall, because that's where the G7 is taking place. We can speak to BBC correspondent John Maguire. What impact is it having on Cornwall?
Well, there are a couple of key locations where the summit will take place. Carbis Bay, you'll have heard a lot about the Carbis Bay Hotel. It's a tiny little beach in West Cornwall, and that's where the leaders will be meeting down at the bottom in the Carbis Bay Hotel there, and then a hotel, Tregenna Castle, another larger hotel on the top. That's where the leaders will be staying. So what we've seen over the last couple of days is a real build-up, the ring of steel, as people are describing it. Also, this is a security bubble, if you like, on the land, sea and the air. So there are Navy ships that will be in the bay. We saw them again yesterday. Thousands and thousands of police officers, in addition to the police officers from Devon and Cornwall Police. Around 1,500 of those were also something like 5,000 officers from right across the UK are coming in to support the effort. The white ship that you'll be able to see behind me there, that cruise liner, that's been chartered as accommodation for the officers, actually, as they've come from right across the UK. There will be road closures in place. The coastal footpath is being closed off in certain sections, and the railway line, just as it gets into St Ives, also closed off. So a little bit of disruption, I suppose, to those people who live in that area. But because of the geography of Cornwall, some of the main sites, for example, Falmouth, where we are, will be the main media site. That's a good sort of 45 minutes away, 18 miles away from the summit site itself, because there just physically isn't enough space to fit everybody in as per a normal G7.
All right, well, thank you very much. It's looking lovely down there. You've got good weather too, so I hope it is all successful. Thank you for speaking to us. And, of course, one of the many things on the agenda for those politicians at the G7 leaders at the G7 summit will be the environment. Andrea, you've written in the Times Red Box today about new California-style plans that will see car makers taxed if they fail to produce enough electric vehicles. I think we can show everybody the headline, but we need a level playing field for UK manufacturers in the green revolution. Now, these plans will be discussed at the G7, but the truth is the infrastructure is just not ready, is it?
Well, the infrastructure has significant billions of pounds of taxpayers' money being invested in improving infrastructure. Already, the range of electric vehicles in the batteries themselves is much better, and the charging infrastructure is improving.
Yeah, but improving is one thing.
Fast, very fast, actually. And, of course, there is huge potential for green jobs, apprenticeships and different technologies right across England, which is something that what Amber Rudd and I are writing about with support from Policy Exchange today. And specifically what we want to see with cars is the government's absolutely rightly agreed zero emissions from the tailpipe by 2030, but there isn't a specific plan to get there. And so what we're proposing is a carbon pricing, which we're taking from work we did in 2015 to get coal off the system, where we announce the date and then we put in a carbon price. And we should do the same with electric vehicles to require manufacturers to be building more and more electric vehicles every year, so that when we get to 2030, we have achieved that deadline.
All right, so these are staging posts, but as I say, there will still be question marks about the rate of increasing the number of chargers in terms of infrastructure. Ian, the news I hear is that you have just either bought or you're leasing an electric car. You've been critical of them in the past. What's changed your mind?
Well, I'm a complete petrol head. I buy all the car magazines, and interestingly, the car magazines are now obsessed with electric cars. They write about virtually nothing else. Andrew is right. There has been a terrific improvement in the network of charging units, but that needs to go forward much faster over the next few years. And I think people are much more open to looking at buying electric cars now. And the tax system also encourages this. That David Cameron always used to talk about the so-called nudge theory, nudging people to do the right thing. And that's what effectively I've done. You can write off an electric car against tax. I'm not buying one outright because I think the technology is improving so quickly that if you have a range for the battery of 300 miles now, in 2 years' time, that will probably be double that. And so you could be left with a virtually obsolete second-hand car in 2 years' time. So I'm doing it on a contract hire. But I'm quite... The thing is, though, you have to plan your journeys much more than you would in a petrol car, because you need to be sure, if you're going on a long journey, that you know where you can get your car charged up.
Right, well, there are two things, Alison. There may be or have been a big increase in the number of chargers, but are they evenly spread? Are there enough of them across the country? And the average cost to buy an electric car in the UK is around £44,000. I mean, that is unaffordable for most people.
Yeah, I mean, clearly at the moment we haven't got enough chargers and it's very expensive, but that's not going to remain the case. As with any kind of new invention into the economy, the change is quite slow at first, and then you reach a tipping point where all of a sudden you're away. And now we have all the major manufacturers are looking at moving almost entirely to electric over the next years. We've got a battery, I think, that's been made in China that can last for 1 million hours. So all these changes that are on the pipeline. You look at the smartphone, when that first was introduced, it was way beyond the pocket of most people. But very, very quickly, they started to come down in price. They started to become more available. They became the norm. And when you reach that tipping point of being the norm, then the infrastructure gathers around it, because all the manufacturers of charging points will be following the money, so they'll be making charging points, and it will happen. It might seem a long way away now, but we will, before we know it, it will all seem quite normal.
Are you going to buy one?
Yeah, I'd buy one. I'm rubbish on cars. I'm probably the total opposite of Ian. But at some point, yes, I think everybody will.
Right. Okay. Well, at some point, what you've already got one, have you? Have you? Because I mean, the SNP have pledged to ban new petrol and diesel cars by 2032. You've got ambitious plans for low-emission cities. But Edinburgh's SNP Council admitted last week that their electricity network doesn't have the capacity to cope with a big shift towards electric vehicles. I mean, if that's the case, then are they the answer?
Well, they are the answer. I think that. And if you look at Scotland, I think the last figure I saw was in just a couple of months ago. Scotland has twice the number of chargers per head of population.
Yeah, but that is a problem, isn't it? If there isn't enough in the electricity network, that's a bind.
Well, obviously, there are going to be challenges. There are going to be challenges in terms of the electricity network going forward anyway as we move to a green economy. One of the ways to cure that, of course, is to invest more and more money into renewable energy, which Scotland is rich in at the moment. We're producing about 100% of our own domestic use in electricity from renewable energy at the moment. And if the UK government would stop wasting money on new nuclear and invest in that, then I think we could get to the point where we can start to power these vehicles and other infrastructure using renewable energy.
If I could just gently point out that the offshore wind off the shores of Scotland is very much subsidised by the UK taxpayer, bill payer.
And which includes the Scottish taxpayer,
indeed, of course it does, but it is a UK effort to create green electricity, which is absolutely the right thing to do. We need to work together, but can I just say...
If you hadn't stood in the face for years of onshore wind, for example, we might be many further miles down the road in terms of being able to do that. Don't forget that it wasn't just onshore wind, but solar power that was held back from not being included in the contracts for difference auctions, and that's really delayed the opportunity for building on our network and producing more green electricity. Now's the time to create that rush to do it so that we can start to supply the EVs of the future.
And of course, Drew, you're absolutely right. But you will recall when I was Energy Minister and you were coming and bringing backbench debates that the big problem is the trilemma. It's also keeping the bills down. So people couldn't afford to heat themselves because of the additional cost on energy bill payers' bills of renewables. So reducing the subsidies was the right thing to do. Offshore wind is a fantastic success story. We've gone from 2015, where a contract for difference was £150 a megawatt hour, to now where it's under £50 a megawatt hour. We've got a fantastic direction of travel. But I did just
want to say much further if it hadn't been for the UK government's obsession with nuclear.
Let's concentrate on the now, because in March the Department of Transport, Andrea, announced cuts to grants that help make electric cars more affordable. Was that wise? They went down the grant from £3,000 to £2,500 and restricted it to cars under £35,000. That doesn't sound like policy underpinning the ambition.
So that is the point that I was making about what I'm calling for today with Amber Rudd and Policy Exchange, which is for a mandate to manufacturers to produce more electric cars each year, or pay carbon credits to those manufacturers who are making electric cars. So the government has two choices. It either mandates, i.e. regulates on manufacturers, or it subsidises consumers. And the subsidy for consumers, it's been employed in places like Norway, it's cost a fortune, but it's had the desired effect. For the UK government, in the past, we have been subsidising consumers to incentivise them to buy electric cars. It would be much better to put the boot on the other foot and incentivise manufacturers to produce the electric cars, because then the price of internal combustion engines will even up with those of electric cars.
Ian?
But Andrew, they're already doing it. Every single car manufacturer is developing plans for a whole range of new electric vehicles. Why do they need to be encouraged to do it when they're already doing it?
You're absolutely right, Ian. They are doing it already. But the point is to get to zero emissions from the tailpipe by 2030. If you talk to car manufacturers, the design is about 5 to 8 years, and then the shelf life is about 5 to 8 years. So the problem is getting from here to 2030 with that sufficient growth, the rapidity of growth. So at the moment, about 1 in 7 new car sales is an electric car. It needs to be significantly higher than that to meet the 2030 deadline.
Are you in a bit of a bind? Oh, yeah, go on, Ian. Respond. I'll just go to Drew.
Isn't one of the problems also, though, that we have no battery manufacturing ability in this country at the moment? And so we are reliant on the world market for that. And one of the things that the government could do is actually encourage a couple of companies to set up and it would be a very expensive thing to do, and there might well need to be some subsidies on that to set up battery manufacturing plants in this country.
Yeah, so I'm pleased to tell you, when I was Business Secretary, I announced the support for a gigafactory here in the UK, and I do believe that there are 2 planned already. But you're right, most batteries at the moment are made in Asia, and that was a big issue with rules of origin under the terms of the Brexit deal. But as Alison said, all of this is going to happen very fast now, and you just look at the way that new technologies become a reality before you even know it. And this does take me back to 2015 when we said we're taking coal off the system. Everyone then said, oh, you'll never do it, the lights will go out. But here we are only 5 years on, and coal is virtually off the system.
Well, while we talk about those sorts of things, are you in a bit of a bind with the SNP? Because oil and gas are central to your plan for independence economically. But the Committee for Climate Change estimated investment in the energy sector may need to double to £50 billion per year to achieve net zero.
Well, we've got a fantastic opportunity at the moment, and indeed it's delivering. I think it's £5.2 billion in renewable energy from Scotland over the past year. That's matching the actual oil and gas output now.
Is it matching that? Well, what about all the redundancies? I mean, Oil and Gas UK point to initial forecasts that direct and indirect redundancies in the industry could be as high as 30,000 due to the pandemic and reduced investment.
Well, that's why the Scottish Government have prioritised the just transition from oil and gas and making sure that we're taking care of those employment needs to transfer people from the oil and gas sector into the renewable sector over a period of time. That's got to be something that we do, not only for the benefit of Scotland, but also for the benefit of the UK, because the UK still imports more than half of its gas for heating, and that's something that we just can't switch off. Otherwise, you have a whole other set of problems. But we do have to accelerate the just transition as quickly as we possibly can, and that means investing much more in renewable energy and putting a lot more behind it, including battery technology, solar, wind, onshore, offshore, and other methods.
All right.
Drew's absolutely right, and also things like the supply ships, all of the infrastructure for the offshore oil and gas can actually be used for offshore renewables. So there is that scope to change those jobs and actually rebuild the Scottish oil and gas as Scottish offshore wind.
Have you got an electric car? Yeah.
I will have one. I don't as yet. But the problem, Joe, actually, is having a car that is not old enough to get rid of. Do you know what I mean? Because you've then got the issues of scrappage. It's a fine balance.
In Scotland, we've incentivised free loans to make sure that they can do it. So
under the Barnett formula. Thank you, Drew.
All right, who's going to get the last word? Me, actually. Right, we're going to talk to our political correspondent, Greg Dawson, who has some breaking news for us. Greg.
Yes, Joe. The High Court has found that the government has acted unlawfully when awarding one of its contracts during the emergence of the COVID-19 outbreak. Now, the accusation made against the government was that it awarded a contract to a company owned by friends of Dominic Cummings. This was a company called Public First, and the award of the contract was worth just over £500,000. Now, the government had argued that this contract was awarded at a time of national emergency. Speed was of the essence. They hired Public First because they needed to assemble focus groups to test the government's COVID-19 health messaging to see if they understood it. Dominic Cummings said he knew of a company that could get the job done. It was a recommendation, but he didn't order civil servants to hire this company. But crucially, no other companies were considered for the contract, and that is what has swayed the judge in this. The judge decided the failure to consider any other companies meant that there was a real possibility, a real danger that the decision maker was biased and that this was therefore unlawful. Now, the judicial review challenge was brought by a group called the Good Law Project, which has accused the government on numerous fronts of essentially giving out contracts to people that it knew without due consideration for public value, basically. We have had a response just quickly from the Cabinet Office. They say that the issues have been addressed. There's no suggestion of actual bias. Public First say they are proud of their work and there is no criticism of the company in this judgment. But clearly it puts the spotlight on the government and its procurement process.
Indeed it does. Greg Dawson, thank you very much. I mean, certainly extremely embarrassing. Charges of cronyism that have been levelled repeatedly at the government and in this particular case found to be enacted unlawfully.
You know, the government has answered this question, and I think all of us as MPs saw at the start of the lockdown the absolute panic. I mean, I was getting probably 100 emails a day from suppliers saying, I can get you face masks, I can get you PPE, I can get you this, that and the other. And it was, for government, it was so difficult to differentiate, to find who were decent contracts, which were cowboys, etc. And so, I mean, the government will take it on the chin and will no doubt be extremely concerned about it. But at the same time, and it's not an excuse, but it is understandable under the circumstances that were around at the time.
Do you accept that? And it wouldn't have been any different for any other government at the heat and the height of this pandemic?
I think we have to take in exactly what's happened here. The government have been found guilty in a court of breaching these rules. That is something that's been highlighted in Parliament about the fact that chums and cronies have been able to get access to the government.
But for the reasons that were set out,
tried to brush it under the carpet and not deal with this properly. The public are entitled to know exactly how their money is being spent in these circumstances, and there should be a full independent public inquiry of what's going on, and it should be soon, not bumped out for years.
All right, we're going to talk about education and also funding, catch-up funding. But before we do, I just want to show our viewers the front page of the Daily Mail and get you to respond. Andrea, the headline says, outrage as Oxford students vote to axe Queen after they claim portrait represents colonial history. This is reporting that students at Magdalen College in Oxford have voted to remove a portrait of the Queen from their common room. The president of Magdalen College said this was a decision for the students, not the college, but she said this was about the students exercising their free speech. Now, Gavin Williamson, the Education Secretary, has intervened, and this is his tweet. Oxford University students removing a picture of the Queen is simply absurd. She is the head of state and a symbol of what is best about the UK during her long reign. She has worked tirelessly to promote British values of tolerance, inclusivity and respect around the world. Should he have intervened, Gavin Williamson?
Well, exercising my own right to free speech, I think those students are utterly pathetic. And I think once they grow up and realise what an incredible asset our Queen is, not only to the United Kingdom and the Commonwealth, but also to the world.
But that may be so, but should the Education Secretary be worrying about an issue like this? I mean, it's a small group of students. They've decided they want to take down a picture. So you think he should have intervened?
Yes.
Do you agree with Gavin Williamson that the Queen is a symbol of British values, Drew, like tolerance, not a symbol of colonialism?
I think the Queen is clearly the head of state. It's a student union that have decided to do that. The students have made this choice themselves. I think it's ridiculous, to be honest, that we're talking about it at this level. There are far more important things that we need to be dealing with just now. The students have made their choice. That's their choice.
Right. Well, let's talk about the big round. That is about catch-up in terms of education. I'll show you this headline in The Guardian. Education recovery chief quits in English schools catch-up row. Sir Kevin Collins said to be dismayed that his long-awaited £15 billion proposals were watered down to a £1.4 billion package. Are you disappointed by the size of the catch-up fund, Andrea?
I can't. It's very difficult to understand exactly why there is such a discrepancy. There's clearly a fundamental disagreement about the basis on which Sir Kevin Collins put forward his proposals. And of course, what the government is seeking to do, and genuinely the Prime Minister is determined to do, is to ensure that every child gets a decent amount of support to recover from the lockdown. Now, that's not just about money. It is about support, mental health support, lengthening the school day and so on. So I don't really have a view on whether one sum is right and the other sum is wrong.
Right. Alison?
Well, clearly, I mean, the number is really disappointing. It works out something like £50 per child, which is really going to give them nothing valuable after the last sort of 15 months they've had. I think if you talk to any teacher, anybody who's a teaching assistant, they will say that the damage on some of the children who are already struggling the most could last for years. It's huge, both emotionally and as well as academically. We know that, the amount of money that was spent in 1 month of Eat Out to Help Out is pretty much the same as what they'll get this year. So being a parent, all about priorities, and it would appear in this case children, again, aren't being prioritised. Again, we had the free school meals thing last year. Again, children slipped down the list of priorities. I'm not sure that's because they're not able to speak for themselves and to be able to articulate the long-term damage that this is doing to them and their futures. But it just seems incredibly depressing because this was a great opportunity to do a bit of levelling up, and it's been passed by.
Ian?
2 points to make. I think it's incredibly simplistic to think that just by sticking an extra half an hour on a school day, that is going to solve everything. Secondly, I think that Gavin Williamson, as Education Secretary, has no political capital to spend, and he's been trodden on by the Treasury. It is as simple as that. And the Prime Minister has taken the side of the Treasury. Now, I don't think that £15 billion necessarily was the right figure. I can't sit here and tell you what I think was the right figure, but I'll tell you what, I know that 50 quid per pupil isn't going to have much of an impact.
Andrea?
Well, the government's response to that is that there is a significant set of different measures, that this £1.5 billion is just one specific announcement and that it's backed up by a number of other
Right, but compared to 15 billion, as the amount suggested, it's not even close, is it?
No, exactly. And as I say, there was clearly a fundamental disagreement about that. But can I just say, I've been chairing an early years review on behalf of the Prime Minister.
Yes.
And his commitment to infancy and to children getting the best start in life is absolutely clear to me.
It may be, but does it have to be matched by money and funding in the way that has been set out post the pandemic?
So the fundamental point is the package of measures the government's putting forward to enable children to catch up sufficient? And it shouldn't be about, is it 50 quid per child? As we all know, there are lots of children who've done incredibly well by being at home with parents who've had the time or the energy and the ability to be able to home tutor them, and those children haven't suffered. There's also a vast swathe of children who've suffered terribly. So it's simplistic to say it's £50 a child.
All right, well,
it's very much more for some and none for others.
Ian, briefly, and then let's go to Drew. Yeah.
We know how this is going to end. Marcus Rashford is going to score a hat-trick in the finals of the Euro, beat the French 7-0, and he will come back and he will get a knighthood and he will force the government into yet another U-turn. That's what's going to happen.
Well, lend me your crystal ball sometime. That will help for future programmes. Drew, in Scotland, the Education Policy Institute has been looking at education catch-up programmes in different countries on a per-pupil basis. Now, the Netherlands is cited as way ahead, spending £2,500 per pupil. In the United States, it's £1,600 per pupil. In England, it's around £310 per pupil. And in Scotland, it's £200 per pupil in the SNP government's plans. So at the moment, your catch-up plan is smaller than the one in England. Are you going to change that?
Well, the Scottish Government have announced they're going to invest £400 million
on top of this.
Well, I need to check that because I've not seen the figures you've got in front of you.
Well, no, these are the government's plans, the SNP's.
I wouldn't know which was included or which was excluded.
Because it will make a massive difference, won't it?
But what I can tell you is that we're going beyond the Barnett consequentials wherever we possibly can. And we would do more if we had been allowed to make some simple changes to the borrowing rules to allow Scotland to do some borrowing, because, of course,
right, but will you commit to spend
in order to...
But is the government going to commit to spend as much as they are in England? Because this analysis says your current plans are £140 million in total. That actually comes down to £200 per pupil.
I don't recognise that. That's the reason I can't answer that, because I don't recognise that figure. What I do know is that...
Well, I assure you will have got that out of your own plans.
The Scottish Government are investing £400 million, which, if you compare with £1.5 billion, is a sizable amount in taking forward this recovery. That includes a range of issues, such as covering mental health issues, catch-up,
right.
New technology and digital technology support. for pupils in schools to take that forward. And I think that we would do a lot more. If the figure in England is adjusted, if it's brought up to the level it should be brought up to, the Barnett consequentials would allow us to do more. But at the moment, we're not allowed to do more because we don't have borrowing powers. We can't adjust.
It's not true that you're not allowed to do more. You could spend more if you made it a priority in terms of education. You could raise taxes.
Like I say, it is a priority in terms of education. I've just given you the sum that's being spent by the Scottish Government on...
So you will spend as much as England per pupil?
Well, I'm certain that we'll spend as much per pupil, yeah.
Right. I mean, Alison, in terms of what you were saying, Ian was saying earlier about Marcus Rashford, is it going to take, in some people's minds, outside influence in order to actually get the government to look at this again?
Well, I think quite possibly so, because it would appear that there is no one really standing up for children, and Rashford's done a great job on that. But it just seems as well, what was the point of putting Kevin Collins to go away and do all that work and to come back with a number, and then to completely and utterly disregard to the point of humiliating him by just rubbishing the whole idea? And I think that's what's really left a lot of the teachers really frustrated and a lot of parents really frustrated, because they're the ones that can actually see that their children have gone backwards in writing and reading, particularly the very young ones. Plus, you've got children that are facing exams that never get back that time. And I think they feel really, really let down, but that hasn't been properly articulated by anybody. So, yes, maybe we do need a Marcus Rashford.
Right. I mean, what was the point of having Kevin Collins do that review?
I think there is a fundamental issue here that someone could announce something that could then be so comprehensively thrown out. So, I mean, that does not usually happen when someone carries out an independent review, is there's more right hand and left hand knowing what each other are doing. So I can't answer that. I'm no longer in government. But what I would say is I had a very good round table with head teachers in my own constituency, one of secondary schools and one of primary schools. And actually, schools themselves have done amazing things to keep children on side. And what the head teachers are really worried about is that it's always the same group of children who struggle in school, whose parents perhaps not as engaged as they should be, and so on.
That's all we have time for, because it is Prime Minister's Questions, and this may well come up today. Thank you very much to all of our guests, Ian, obviously, and to you here in the studio. Bye-bye.
Mr. Speaker, I'm delighted that the UK is hosting the leaders of the world's greatest democracies at the G7 summit in Cornwall this week. This is the first meeting between G7 leaders since the start of the pandemic. Mr. Speaker, this week is Carers Week, and I'm sure the whole House will wish to join me in thanking care workers and everyone caring for family, friends and loved ones. Their selflessness and devotion to helping others is an inspiration to us all. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others in addition to my duties in this House. I shall have further such meetings later today.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and can I very much echo the comments of the Prime Minister on the work of unpaid carers. But after plenty of warm words for the victims of fire and rehire, including from the Prime Minister himself, the Government yesterday announced its legislative response to the ACAS report of doing absolutely nothing. Nothing for the hundreds of thousands already threatened, or as the ACAS report itself says, the many, many more that are anticipated to face fire and rehire when the furlough scheme ends. He should be thoroughly ashamed of himself, Mr. Speaker. It's increasingly clear this Government won't protect workers, so will it devolve employment law to Holyrood so the Scottish Government can?
Actually, Mr. Speaker, this Government has been absolutely clear that it's unacceptable to use threats of firing and rehiring as a negotiating tactic. We welcome the ACAS report, which actually finds that hire and fire should only be used in limited circumstances, such as to prevent job losses, Mr. Speaker, when other options have been exhausted. We therefore asked ACAS to produce clearer guidance to help employers with other options.
Bradley.
Prime Minister, we're on a mission in the East Midlands to create 84,000 jobs for local people. We're legislating for planning powers for our development corporation, which will work in tandem with our unique inland Freeport. But, Mr. Speaker, decisions about HS2 and specifically the Toton Hub will have a huge impact on whether we can deliver on our vision for the East Midlands. Would the Prime Minister meet with me urgently so we can make sure we can deliver on that commitment to local people?
Mr. Speaker, the East Midlands could have no more fervent or effective champion, and I congratulate my honourable friend on his vision for the East Midlands Freeport and all the benefits that rail integration will bring. And I know that he's about to have a meeting with ministerial colleagues to determine how the integrated rail plan can work with HS2 best to achieve his objectives.
Let's go to the Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is the first PMQ since the Prime Minister and Carrie got married. So can I offer my warm congratulations to the Prime Minister and his wife and wish them a happy life together. I have to say I admire the way they managed to keep it secret. Can I join with the Prime Minister on his comments about Carers Week? And can I also send our deepest sympathies to the 4 people killed in Sunday's terror attack in Canada? It was, as the Canadian Prime Minister said, an attack motivated by hatred and Islamophobia, and we must all unite against that at home and abroad. And can I ask the Prime Minister to pass on our thoughts and condolences to the Canadian Prime Minister when he sees him later this week? Mr. Speaker, why does the Prime Minister think that his now former education advisor, Kevin Collins, described the government's education plan as half-hearted, that risked failing thousands of children, hundreds of thousands of children, and not being even close to meeting the scale of what is needed?
Mr. Speaker, first of all, I want to thank Kevin Collins for his work, and but above all, I want to thank actually pupils, parents, teachers for everything they've done throughout this pandemic. And the struggle has been enormous, and actually what the government is doing is, in addition to the £14 billion, the extra £14 billion we committed, taking per pupil funding in primary schools up to £4,000 per head, in secondary schools up to £5,150, Mr. Speaker. We're now putting another £3 billion into educational catch-up with the biggest tutoring programme anywhere in the world, Mr. Speaker, and it is based on the best evidence that we could find and that Sir Kevin could supply.
Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, let me get this right. In February, the Prime Minister appoints an expert to come up with a catch-up plan for education. He's a highly respected expert, consults widely, and comes up with a plan. The Treasury balks at it and says we'll only provide 10%, yes, 1/10 of what's needed. The Prime Minister rolls over whatever he says, and children lose out. So much for levelling up. Let me help the Prime Minister with the numbers. The funding he announced last week is about £50 per child per year. And even if you add in previous announcements, in England it's only £310 per child over 4 years. Yet in the US there's a catch-up plan worth £1,600 per child. And in the Netherlands it's £2,500. So can the Prime Minister explain, when he was told by his expert that he appointed that only an ambitious, fully funded catch-up plan would do, only an ambitious, fully funded catch-up plan, why did he come up with something which, in the words of that same expert, is too small, too narrow and too slow?
Mr. Speaker, I think that the right honourable gentleman needs to do the maths, because actually, and he needs to do some catch-up on his own mathematics, because in addition to the 14 billion I've already referred to, Mr. Speaker, there was already another £1.5 billion of catch-up. This is a £3 billion catch-up plan just for starters, Mr. Speaker, and it includes the biggest programme of tuition of 1-to-1, 1-to-2, 1-to-3 tutorials anywhere in the world. And we all know, Mr. Speaker, that there are schools in this country, classrooms in this country, where children are getting private tutorials, private tuition, thanks to the hard work of their parents. He asks about levelling up. What we want to do is get on the side of all the kids who don't have access to that tutorial, Mr. Speaker, to support them. That's what I mean by levelling up, Mr. Speaker.
Who does the Prime Minister think he's kidding? He asked Kevin Collins to tell him what was necessary to catch up. Kevin Collins told him, and he said no. Who does he think he's kidding? The Chancellor's decision, and I assume it was the Chancellor's decision, it always is, to hold back the investment that's needed is a completely false economy. The long-term costs are likely to be at least £100 billion, probably more, and who will be hardest hit, Prime Minister? Kids from disadvantaged backgrounds. Mr. Speaker, if the government doesn't change course, this will hold Britain back for a generation. And here's the difference between us and them. Because when Labour says education is our #1 priority, we mean it. That's why we published a bold £15 billion plan to catch up on education for every child. We're putting that to a vote this afternoon. If the Prime Minister is really serious about this, he'd back that motion. Will he do so?
I'll tell you that, Mr. Speaker, I'll tell you the difference between us and the party opposite is that we put in the tough measures that are needed to give kids a better education across the country. When we rolled out the Academies programme, Mr. Speaker, which have driven up standards across the country, who opposed it? They did. When we put in tough measures to ensure discipline in schools, Mr. Speaker, they opposed it. At the last election, Mr. Speaker, they even campaigned to get rid of Ofsted, which is so vital. But they did. He stood on a manifesto to get rid of Ofsted. Will he now say that he not only supports our tuition programme, but he supports our radical programme to support teachers with better training? £400 million we're now putting in, not only a starting salary for teachers of £30,000, which we've introduced, but another £400 million to support better training for teachers. That's what we're backing in our party. They are serious, costed reforms and are based on evidence, unlike anything he's producing.
Just a moment, and we'll have a little less shouting from the side. Just to remind the Prime Minister, his Prime Minister's questions, it isn't about the agenda of last general election. Keir Starmer. The Prime Minister, Ofsted, was not the question. I'm not interested in what they put on the agenda. I'm more interested in you answering the question. Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, let me take this very slowly for the Prime Minister. The Collins review commissioned by the government was very clear. If the Collins proposed action is not taken, the attainment gap will rise between 10 and 24%. That was on a slide shown to the Prime Minister last week. And he talks about the various measures, so let's look at this more closely. Which part of our plan does he oppose? The plan that's being voted on this afternoon. Is it breakfast clubs for every child? Does he oppose that? Is it quality mental health support in every school? Does he oppose that? Is it more tutoring for every child that needs it? Does he oppose that? Or additional investment for children who've suffered the most? Which part of our plan does the Prime Minister object to? And if he doesn't object to it and agrees with it, why doesn't he vote for it?
Mr. Speaker, I think with great respect, Mr. Speaker, I do think I'm entitled to draw attention to what the Labour Party stood on at the last election. And that was, and they haven't yet repudiated it, they did want to get rid of Ofsted, Mr. Speaker. But I will tell the right honourable gentleman that if he is now saying that he supports our tutoring programme, and that's what I think I understood from him just now, then that is a good thing, because hitherto what has happened is that the kids of well-off parents, thanks to their hard work, have been able to rely on private tutoring. What the government is now doing is coming in on the side of all the other kids who don't get access to that tutoring. 6 million kids, 6 million children, Mr. Speaker, 6 million children will have access to tuition thanks to this programme. It is a fantastic thing. It is a revolution in education for this country. If he's now saying that he supports it, Mr. Speaker, then that's a good thing, though I've learnt in the course of the last year that his support can sometimes be evanescent, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, he pretends he's here for the other kids. The report says the attainment gap will go up between 10 to 24% if the action isn't taken. He's just rejected it. How can he be on the side of the other kids? Come off it. We've been here before. Free school meals, U-turn, exams fiasco, U-turn, now catch-up. The Prime Minister's been all over the place when it comes to education. And he's on the wrong side of it again. Mr. Speaker, I now want to turn to this week's G7. This will be the first major summit of since the recovery. The UK needs to lead, not just to host. The priority must, of course, be a clear plan to vaccinate the world. As the Delta variant shows, nobody is safe from this virus until everybody is safe. The Prime Minister has made big promises on this, but it needs a truly global effort to make it happen. So will the Prime Minister take the lead at the G7 and do whatever is necessary to make global vaccinations a reality?
Yes, indeed, Mr. Speaker. And actually, I think what the people of this country also understand is that not only were we able to give one of the first authorisations for the AstraZeneca the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, but also thanks to the deal the government did between the Oxford scientists and AstraZeneca, we were able to ensure that 1 in 3 of the 1.5 billion doses that have been distributed around the world are the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine. That is global Britain in action, to say nothing of the billion vaccines that we hope to raise from the G7 this week.
Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, that would sound a lot better if the Prime Minister wasn't the only G7 leader cutting his aid budget. I hear what the Prime Minister says about vaccines, but we also need clear global agreement and global funding. Hundreds of former leaders, businesses and development groups have called for exactly that kind of leadership at the G7. And that's what we need to see from the Prime Minister this weekend. Mr. Speaker, the G7, bilateral discussions with President Biden and the possibility of a new government in Israel also provide a real chance to restart a meaningful Middle East peace process. The appalling violence recently, which killed 63 children in Gaza and 2 children in Israel, shows just how urgent this is. For too many people in Palestine, the promise of an end to the occupation and a recognised sovereign Palestinian state feels more distant than ever. So will the Prime Minister take the opportunity this weekend to press for renewed international agreement, to finally recognise the state of Palestine alongside a safe and secure Israel, to stop the expansion of illegal settlements and to get a meaningful peace process back up and running?
Mr. Speaker, it's been a long-standing objective of this government, and I think it's common ground across this House that the solution for the Middle East peace process is a two-state solution. We continue to press for that, and I've made that position plain in my conversations both with the Palestinian Authority and, of course, with Israel. Mr. Speaker, he attacked the government, I think, for failing to be sufficiently ambitious in our overseas aid spending. I think I heard him say that in that compendious question. And let me just tell him, well, he's gesturing at these benches, Mr. Speaker. Under this government, we've spent more, and we continue to spend more than Labour ever did. Labour ever did. Under Blair, under Brown, even when they were spending money on Brazilian dancers in Hackney to raise consciousness, which is what they did, to raise consciousness of global poverty, Mr. Speaker. We are spending £10 billion a year at a time of acute financial difficulty for this country, and I think the British people know that is the right priority for this country. And I think, if Labour members want to vote on that matter, Mr. Speaker, and may I just remind them that the people of this country had an opportunity to vote on the way the government is handling it last month, and the balance that we were striking, and I think that they adjudicated firmly in the favour of the government, Mr. Speaker. They pontificate and prevaricate and procrastinate.
Felicity Kendall, come on! Look at even.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You've made me slightly older, yes. I am very proud of my government's record on the environment and the fact that we have cut emissions at the fastest rate of any G7 country. I welcome the fact that Lancaster West Estate in my constituency has benefited from a green grant of almost £20 million to decarbonise. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that we need to build back better in a green way and in a way that levels up all parts of the United Kingdom?
Yes, I do, and I thank you, Mr. Speaker. My honourable friend is absolutely right. That's why we committed a total of £3.8 billion to fund energy improvement in the performance, particularly of social rented homes.
Leader of the SNP, Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm sure we're all looking forward to the European Championships kicking off later this week. Can I take the opportunity to wish all the best to our country, Scotland, to Steve Clarke and the team, and to remind the team it is time for heroes. Mr. Speaker, later this week the Prime Minister will walk into the G7 summit as the only leader, Prime Minister, cutting development aid to the world's poorest. At the very moment when global leadership is needed more than ever, This Tory government is walking away from millions still struggling from the COVID pandemic and a poverty pandemic. The Prime Minister has been hiding on this issue for months. This is a government on the run from their own moral and legal responsibilities and on the run, Mr Speaker, from their own backbenchers. But the Prime Minister can't hide from this issue any longer, and he can't run from democracy in this House. Will he stand up today and commit to a straight vote in this House on these inhumane cuts as demanded by the Speaker? Prime Minister, it is a very simple question. Yes or no?
And by the way, Mr. Speaker, wish all the very best to Scotland and England and all the home nations who may be playing in this. I don't know whether he's going to reciprocate, Mr. Speaker, but you never know. It's worth a shot. I thought. Oh, you did? Okay, there you go. That's nice of him. Anyway, Mr. Speaker, I think the answer is clear. The people of this country, as I said to the right honourable gentleman, were given a vote on this and many other matters very recently, and I think they adjudicated very firmly in favour of the balance the government is striking. We are in very, very difficult financial times, but you shouldn't believe the lefty propaganda, Mr. Speaker, that you hear from people opposite. We're spending £10 billion overseas. We've actually increased. All they want to do is run this country down, Mr. Speaker. Run this country down. When we've increased spending on girls' education alone to £500 million, almost £500 million. That is a fantastic sum of money to be spending in difficult times, Mr. Speaker. We should be proud.
Ian Blackford.
Mr Speaker, I have to say I don't think I've ever heard the previous Prime Minister, the right honourable member for Maidenhead, called a leftist propagandist. The simple fact of the matter, Prime Minister, is every single party, every single member of this House stood on a manifesto commitment of 0.7%. The Prime Minister has reneged on that, and the Speaker has indicated that the government should allow a vote on it. It's pretty basic stuff. After a year dealing with the deadly virus, why can't the Prime Minister get this? In a pandemic, no one is safe until everyone is safe. Now is the time to support each other, not to walk away from those in need. People are dying and they need our help. The Prime Minister has the nerve to brag about the government support for the vulnerable, and at the very same time, he is slashing £4.5 billion from the world's poorest. In the week of the G7, what kind of world leader washes their hands of responsibility by cutting water and hygiene projects by more than 80% in the middle of a pandemic?
Mr. Speaker, I may say that I think that the last contribution was absolutely disgraceful, because the people of this country have gone through a very difficult time. We've had to spend £407 billion supporting jobs, families, livelihoods throughout the country, and yet we are continuing to support international vaccination. £1.6 billion this country has contributed to Gavi. I think £548 million to COVAX. And let me just remind him of the statistic I mentioned earlier. 1 in 3 of the vaccines being distributed around the world to the poorest and the neediest come from the Oxford AstraZeneca supply. Thanks to the deal this government did. Or does the name Oxford AstraZeneca continue to stick in his craw, Mr. Speaker?
Scott Benton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. May I welcome plans outlined by the Education Secretary last week, which will oversee a tutoring revolution in this country, a proven way to help the most disadvantaged children to catch up. Is the Prime Minister able to confirm that this is just one part of our wider plan to ensure that no child misses out as a consequence of a disruption caused by this pandemic?
Yes, Mr. Speaker. I thank my honourable friend, because the whole point of the tutoring programme is that it is evidence-based, and every tutoring programme, and I say there are 6 million pupils, children who can benefit, is equivalent to 3 to 5 months of educational catch-up. We're also, Mr. Speaker, going to be looking at increasing time in schools. And I hope that the loyal opposition, Mr. Speaker, may use their influence with their paymasters in the teaching unions to encourage them in that objection.
Colin Maxwell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister knows full well that the best way to reduce checks in the Irish Sea is to do a Swiss-style SBS agreement with the European Union. So far, he's decided not to do that. So why is he prioritising cheap, dodgy beef from Australia over the concerns of the people of Northern Ireland and reducing checks in the Irish Sea?
No, Mr. Speaker. What we're prioritising is the right and ability of the people of Northern Ireland to have access, as they should, freely and uninterruptedly to goods and services from the whole of the UK, and we are working to ensure that we protect the territorial and economic integrity of our country. That's what matters.
Kevin Holland.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister's excellent First Homes policy will allow tens of thousands of key workers and local first-time buyers to buy a home every year at a discount of up to 50% from the market price. Would you consider turbocharging this policy by establishing a National Land Commission to assemble public sector land to facilitate the development of potentially hundreds of thousands of more half-price homes, so more people can see the benefits of home ownership?
I thank my honourable friend. Last year we delivered the highest, in spite of the difficulties we face, the highest number of new homes for over 30 years, but his point is an extremely good one, as all honourable members know. We must find better, faster ways of releasing publicly owned land, brownfield sites for development, and that is exactly why we're looking at the suggestion he makes.
Barisha.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister, in his very first speech, mentioned levelling up. My constituents want to know when it's going to start. The fact of the matter, and I understand that he's lived a life of privilege and doesn't know much about the public state sector. He knows a lot about the private sector in education. What are the markers for success? His head of his own Industrial Strategy Council says he's levelling up. With these resources, with this management team, will not work and will not be successful. My local Kirklees Council says it's so complex, nothing is flowing down to the grassroots. When will we see the first signs of genuine levelling up in our country?
Mr. Speaker, I think that what you're seeing across the country is people responding to massive investment, £640 billion programme of investment in roads, in schools, in hospitals, in policing, bit by bit is transforming people's lives, hopes and opportunities. And that is fundamentally the difference between his side of the argument and ours. We believe that there is talent, genius, flair around the whole country, but opportunity is not evenly distributed. And that is our ambition, and that is what we are doing with our campaign to levelling up. If he's now saying, by the way, that he supports what we're doing on the tutoring revolution, because I know he's a great educational expert, then I'm glad to hear it.
Brendan Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My constituents in Bassetlaw have been the victims of illegal encampments, most recently at Farr Park in Worksop, where local taxpayers have been left with a clean-up bill running into thousands of pounds, and residents have been left feeling powerless following a sustained period of antisocial behaviour in the locality. Can the Prime Minister tell us what steps we are taking now to ensure we stop this from happening in the future and allow residents and local authorities to take back control of trespassing?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Bill, my honourable friend will be pleased to know, introduce a new criminal offence where a person who resides or intends to reside on land with a vehicle and without permission has caused or is likely to cause significant damage or distress can face new penalties, Mr. Speaker. And guess who voted against that bill on a three-line whip? Does anybody know? It was the right honourable gentleman and his entire party.
Ian Hamilton.
Mr. Speaker, a few years ago, one of my elderly constituents with late-stage dementia was married by a man who'd befriended her. Upon her death, the man subsequently inherited the whole of her estate because under the law as it stands, their marriage had revoked her previous will. Hundreds of people since then have contacted me citing similar experiences, but 3 registrars general have refused to meet me to discuss it. So will the Prime Minister now act to bring this cruel exploitation to an end?
Well, I thank the honourable gentleman for raising the concern that he has and the injustice that he mentioned. I'll make sure that he gets a meeting as soon as possible with the relevant Minister in the Justice Department.
David Jones.
Mr. Speaker, according to newspaper reports, the European Union are unhappy with the negotiating style of the Right Honourable Lord Frost. But does my right honourable friend agree that, in fact, Lord Frost is doing a superb job negotiating in the national interest? And does he further agree with Lord Frost's assessment that the Northern Ireland Protocol, as currently applied, is unsustainable, and that matters would be considerably easier if the European Union were to adopt a more pragmatic approach rather than the purist approach they're adopting at the moment?
I thank my right honourable friend, and I agree with him completely, because I think that David Frost, Lord Frost, is doing an outstanding job, and I venture to say, Mr. Speaker, he is the greatest Frost since the Great Frost of 1709, whatever it was.
Andrew Gwynn.
Thank you. The Prime Minister has seen his advisor on ethics and standards resign over his failure to uphold the ministerial code. He's seen the head of the government's legal department resign over his failure to uphold international law. And he's seen his advisor on education catch-up resign over his failure to provide proper funding for children. Why does the Prime Minister think this keeps happening to him?
Mr. Speaker, I'm indebted to everybody who serves the government in whatever capacity. We have a lot of very tough decisions to make, but we will continue to get on with delivering the people's priorities. And by the way, we will continue to ensure that we deliver value for money, that we don't waste taxpayers' money, and that ministers follow the ministerial code.
Theresa May.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In April 1989, 96 Liverpool fans were unlawfully killed at Hillsborough. Yet nobody has been successfully prosecuted for their part in those unlawful killings. The most recent trial collapsed because although it was accepted that police evidence had been altered, because it was evidence to a public inquiry, it did not constitute perversion in the course of justice. Will my right honourable friend urgently look at the ramifications of this judgment for current and future public inquiries, and ensure that in future people are given the justice that has been so cruelly denied to the families of the Hillsborough 96?
Mr. Speaker, I thank my right honourable friend for her question, and of course the families of the 96 who died in the Hillsborough disaster and those who were injured have shown tremendous courage and determination. Now, my right honourable friend raises a particular issue about the recent court case and asks for a review of the law, and I can give her the assurance that we will always consider opportunities to review the law and how it operates if necessary, and we will certainly be looking at the case she describes.
Let's go to Peter Grant. Peter.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In just over 3 years, the directors of Blackmore Bond plc took £46 million of other people's money and made it disappear. Around 2,800 small investors who the directors promised that money would be secure now face losing everything. Most of the money, around £26 million, was only taken by Blackmore Bond after the Financial Conduct Authority had compelling evidence from an expert witness who told them he thought the company was breaking the law, but before the FCA took any decisive action. How many more scandals like this will it take before we have a regulatory environment that's fit for purpose and offers our constituents proper protection against investment scams?
I thank the honourable gentleman for raising the case he does. And I'm afraid, Mr. Speaker, I have no advance notice of it and can't comment on the case in question, except to say if he will send me details, we will get back to him as soon as we can.
David.
I'm delighted that Southend-on-Sea has now been given the opportunity to become a city. But in the 50s, 60s and 70s, 1.5 million ladies were forced to give up their babies for adoption. By any standards, that was cruel, and the hurt is still felt by those ladies today. So will my right honourable friend agree with me that an apology should be given and an acknowledgement that forced adoptions was wrong by all those involved in the process.
Mr. Speaker, I echo my right honourable friend's sentiments about Southend, but also what he says about those who've been affected by forced adoption. The practices that led to forced adoption can't now occur because the law protects both parents. He asked for an apology, Mr. Speaker, and I can tell him that the agencies involved in forced adoption in the past have apologised for their role, Mr. Speaker, and quite right too.
Let's go to Ian Lavery. Ian.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As eloquently highlighted by my right honourable friend, the Leader of the Opposition, recent reports have revealed that during the pandemic, the loss in learning has been absolutely catastrophic. The North East is once again sadly trailing the field, and in some subjects more than double the loss of other regions. The attainment gap, which has been mentioned, between the most and least affluent areas is set to grow potentially at 10 to 24%. That's desperate, really desperate. The government's catch-up funding is quite simply derisory, too small, too narrow, too slow, or comments being articulated by the former Education Recovery Chief before his unfortunate resignation. Prime Minister, the parents in Wansbeck, in my constituency, are listening. You've got a wonderfully privileged educational background. Can you use it to explain how 20 pence per day helps kids in my patch catch up?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I can tell the honourable gentleman that he's, again, I'm afraid what he's saying is completely wrong. The sums are huge that we're already investing in education, and we've announced a £3 billion additional package of catch-up, including the biggest, not just investing in teacher training, another 400 million to help teachers improve their qualifications as they go up the ladder, but also the biggest tuition programme in the history of this country, the biggest anywhere in the world. And that will make a huge difference to young people in Wansbeck and across the country. Many kids are getting private tuition at the moment, Mr. Speaker, loads aren't. We want to level up.
Mr. Speaker, recently I met with Gianni Singh, who founded the Sikh Helpline 25 years ago and is based on West Bromwich High Street. We met to hear about the fantastic work they've done over the years supporting the community with advice on issues such as hate crime, domestic violence, bullying, mental health, addiction and more. Will the Prime Minister join me in thanking Gianni G and their team for their work and wish them the very best of luck with their 350-mile charity bike ride from Edinburgh to West Bromwich next month?
I thank my honourable friend for raising the important work of Sikh Helpline UK, and I'm very happy to join her in wishing Gianni Singh and her team the very best of luck for their charity bike ride, Mr. Speaker.
Jonathan Edwards.
Mr. Speaker, Brexit is quickly turning into a story of betrayals. Firstly, it was the Northern Irish Unionists, then it was the fishermen, and now our farmers face a skewed trade deal with Australia. Yeah. The big question, therefore, is who comes next? Considering that the Trade Remedies Authority want to cut the protections on a half of steel products previously protected by the EU, are our steel industry and the vast supply chain they sustain next in line?
Yeah. No, Mr. Speaker, but can I just suggest to the honourable gentleman that once again he is completely missing, I think, the dynamism and optimism of so many people I meet in the agricultural sector who see opportunities for Welsh lamb and Welsh beef around the world. Why isn't he thinking of this as something as an opportunity for exports, Mr. Speaker, instead of cowering in this way? Welsh lamb, Welsh beef, Welsh farmers can do brilliantly from the deals we are opening up around the world, and he should be championing Welsh agriculture and Welsh produce.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In East Surrey, I've been working with brilliant parish councils in Smallfield, Burstow and Horn to ensure we can get a better balance on HGV movements, allowing local businesses to thrive, but also ensuring that residents feel safe. I welcome the government's work to clamp down on moving traffic offences, but would the Prime Minister also consider taking another look at the powers of the Traffic Commissioner to ensure that we can find this balance?
Prime Minister. Yes, Mr. Speaker, I thank my honourable friend for raising this point. Traffic enforcement outside London can only be undertaken by the police, but I will certainly look at the role of the Traffic Commissioner in the cases that she describes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Our greatest national asset, best of this country, record increase in funding, saved my life, no question, my #1 priority. All things the Prime Minister said about our NHS. Yet, award-winning South Tyneside Hospital has lost vital services and been told by his government to make further cuts to remaining services. Later today, I'm presenting a petition on behalf of over 40,000 of my constituents against these cuts. Like me, they want him to help us save our hospital and show for once that he is able to match his rhetoric with some action. Will he?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, and all the changes that she mentions will be consulted on in the usual way. I note that Dr. Shahid Wahid, the Executive Medical Director of the Trust, was recently quoted in the Shields Gazette as saying this is about improving surgical services. It is not about downgrading anything. And she mentions cuts, Mr. Speaker. This government, this year alone, has given another £92 billion to support our NHS, on top of the huge commitments we already made.
Final question, Jacob Young.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday we had the fantastic announcement of £25 million of investment into Redcar Town Centre, which will allow us to build a new water sports facility at Cortham, a new indoor activity centre on the Esplanade, and give the town a much-needed lift. I'm working with the Council on other bids for Eston and TS6 area, but in the meantime, can I invite the Prime Minister to come to the mighty Redcar and see our plans for levelling up our area, and I'll even treat him to a lemon top.
Thank you. Well, Mr. Speaker, I thank my honourable friend, who is a fantastic advocate for the people of Redcar, and thanks at least partly to his advocacy, we've announced a town's deals to benefit Redcar. The Levelling Up Fund will help secure local investment in infrastructure and communities in Redcar, and as and when my diary permits, Mr. Speaker, I would be thrilled to come and join him for what I think he described as a lemon top.
On that basis, I'm now suspending the House for 3 minutes to enable...
That brings us to the end of this week's Prime Minister's Questions with talk about lemon top. Let me introduce our guest for this part of the programme. Robin Walker is the Minister for Northern Ireland. Steve Reid for the Labour Party, the Shadow Community Secretary. And in the studio with me, Vicky Young, the BBC's Deputy Political Editor. Perhaps unsurprisingly, Keir Starmer decided to start his questions on education. This following the news that the Education Recovery Commissioner last week resigned because the government has decided not to take on his recommendations, particularly about the amount of money that should be spent on catch-up funding. Did we learn anything new from the exchanges on that?
I mean, maybe not. I think, yes, £15 billion was the number that some people were talking about around Whitehall that Sir Kevin Collins wanted for this catch-up programme. Now, in reality, it's £1.5 billion if you look at it one way. The Prime Minister today insisting actually it's £3 billion just for starters, he says, so keeping the option open there that there could be more money to come. But I think Keir Starmer knows that there is a slight problem here for the government, not just that the catch-up on education is going to be such a massive issue for years to come, not just this year, but for a long, long time. But when you've got the government really with their slogan of build back better and their other slogan of levelling up, the question is, how do you do that? What does it mean in reality? And what Labour would say is, in reality, it means finding the money to help particularly the disadvantaged, who we know have suffered the most, those children who have lost out on their education and fallen so far behind. Is he willing then to find the money to do this? And I think that's what Sir Keir Starmer was trying to get at here, to say, look, you talk about all this all the time, you have this rhetoric, sounds really good, but when it comes to the reality of finding the money, the Treasury is saying no. And I think the other issue here that the government has, the problem they have, is we all know that hundreds of billions of pounds have been spent on COVID. And so what every department is saying and what every person who wants more money is saying is, well, it's nothing. It's a rounding up error and compared to how much we've spent. And that's a real problem for the government and for Boris Johnson. He is someone who we know actually wants to spend some more money. But of course, a lot of money has already been spent.
Robin, what was the point of asking Kevin Collins to actually carry out this review and ask him how much was needed for children to catch up on their lost education and then reject the number and the figure that he came up with?
Well, I think the point clearly was to bring in a recognised expert, and I think someone of the opposition recognised as an expert,
and ignore him.
To make sure that the right approaches were being prioritised. And I think in adopting the recommendations on tuition and also on extra support for teacher training, we've ensured that that can be delivered on. Of course, there's always going to be a challenge with meeting the expectations for resources. Labour have the luxury in opposition of not needing to worry about that, and that's why they will always call for more money to be spent. But what we saw when Labour were in government was great schemes announced, which they then ran out of funding for, like the Building Colleges for the Future programme, which promised a new college for my constituency but never got delivered.
All right, well, let's concentrate on what you're doing in government, because the catch-up package, as Vicky was saying, is £3.1 billion for England, spread over multiple years. Honestly, hand on heart, do you think that is enough to make up for the damage done to children's learning over the course of this pandemic?
By itself, clearly it wouldn't be, but I think you have to remember this comes on the back of a £40 billion increase in education spending over that period, on the back of raising the funding for the lowest funded areas, like the constituency I represent, which was one of the lowest funded areas in the country under the previous government.
Sorry, where's that figure?
So that every secondary school is getting over £5,000, every primary school is getting over £4,000 per pupil per year. That increase is already baked into the system and on its way. And this is funding on top of that, specifically to address the challenges of COVID.
Right, Boris Johnson said back in 2019 he announced an extra £14 billion of school funding in England, not 40, which you said that may just have been a mistake. But even on the £14 billion of school funding, the Institute for Fiscal Studies has previously pointed out that that figure is bogus, they say. They say the £14 billion figure was generated by ignoring inflation and by double counting all of the different years. They said the actual figure in real terms is £4.3 billion extra for schools in England over 3 years, not £14 billion. Can you stop saying £14 billion then on that basis?
No, I'd say 14.4 billion, which is the figure that I have seen repeatedly and is reflected in the fact that schools in constituencies like mine, which have been some of the lowest funded areas of the country, are seeing substantial year-on-year increase.
Yeah, but hang on that figure, sorry, and I'm quoting the IFS here, the Institute for Fiscal Studies, they say that figure ignores inflation and it is double counting all of the different years. Are you saying they're wrong?
What I'm saying is we've seen real terms increases over inflation. And we're seeing, crucially, the per pupil funding that schools are receiving increasing in each and every year. That's an £840 increase in per pupil funding, which is the key measure that I know, having previously chaired the F40 group that looks very in great detail in these issues, is the key measure that schools use to see what they're getting. Now, those increases are real. This funding, this extra £3 billion, is on top of those increases, and I think it will make a real difference.
Right. Steve, I'll come back to you on the per pupil funding in just a moment. Steve, Labour has committed to spending £14.7 billion, much closer to the amount that Kevin Collins was talking about over 2 years. What will that money be spent on, and how will you know it's good value?
Well, Labour's published the Education Recovery Plan that details how that will be spent, so you or your viewers can look at the detail in there. But it's looking at things like breakfast and holiday clubs to make sure that children get additional learning support, new activities for every child, high quality support for children and young people that are experiencing mental ill health. And there's an awful lot of children who are experiencing that, particularly after the effects of the lockdown and the impact that's had on their families, and increasing one-on-one tutoring for students as well. Now, it's interesting, isn't it, that the figure in Labour's Education Recovery Plan is very similar to the figure that the government's education czar, Sir Kevin Collins, came up with.
Yes.
And yeah, as we heard earlier on, the government recruited Sir Kevin to do this piece of work. He carried out a consultation. He came up with a programme, and the government decided to only award 1/10 of the funding, and Sir Kevin has resigned in protest.
And we've covered that. But how are you going to raise that money, £14.7 billion, from borrowing or higher taxes?
Well, I mean, the way that Labour will be raising money will be all detailed in our manifesto. But one of the other issues that is very current at the moment is corporation tax and taxes on tech giants. If the government would stop trying to water down the level that Joe Biden and the other 6 members of the G7 are looking at making as a baseline for corporation tax for tech giants. Interestingly, that would raise £15 billion per year, which is twice the amount of the 15 billion over 2 years that we think should be spent on education recovery. So there are ways to raise this if the government would stop trying to water down the amount of money that we could get in by acting globally together to stop giant corporations avoiding their tax.
Robin?
The government's just gone further than any previous government in history at making sure that there is global action on this. And I'm delighted that the G7 summit that we're chairing is going to see progress, I sincerely hope, on the issue of global taxation, making sure that the tech giants pay a fair share of tax and making sure that they pay more corporation tax than they have been previously. I think this is an area where there's cross-party consensus. We can raise.
No, the government's out on a limb here. They are alone in the G7 in trying to water it down to below 21%. All the other 6 support that. Boris Johnson's trying to water it down. So we're not leading.
I think
we're
Boris
trailing
Johnson,
behind.
But Boris Johnson is delivering global leadership on this issue. Rishi Sunak has achieved more than any of his predecessors did in getting a consensus on this issue. But clearly, there's going to be challenges to come when we take what the G7 have agreed to the OECD, where we have a greater variety in corporation tax rates. And we will want to get as many countries as possible on board with this. That will benefit the whole world in terms of our ability to raise tax. But I find it ironic that we have this criticism coming from a Labour front bench that only a few months ago were criticising us for raising corporation tax. And this is something that we need to be clear. Yes, we've had to take some tough decisions to fund the huge amount of investment that we've needed during the COVID pandemic. But we think companies absolutely have to play their part in funding that.
Can I just return briefly to education? Because Sir Kevin Collins pointed out when he resigned that the impact in terms of school closures because of COVID-19 was particularly severe in parts of the north of England, and disadvantaged children were hit hardest. Where does that leave your levelling up strategy, Robin?
Well, I think it's
Robin, we're having slight problems with your line. Hang on. We're having slight problems with your line. We'll just try once more, and otherwise we might have to redial you, and I will talk to... Oh, no, you've frozen. Steve...
The levelling up strategy does. We have the level... And as the Prime Minister indicated, this 3 billion is only the start.
Right. As I say, we may have to redial you up in terms of your line. Steve, in terms of the amount of money that's being spent, you've committed this £15 billion for schools. You want to reverse the foreign aid cut. You want to make the extra £20 a week for universal credit permanent. You don't want to raise any new taxes. Do your numbers actually add up?
Well, we haven't committed the money yet. We've got a vote in Parliament this afternoon, actually, on the education recovery plan. So me and my colleagues and actually Robin and his colleagues can all choose whether they do or don't want to put their money where their mouth is and invest in children's futures. And I think you have to look at this issue, not just in terms of the money we're putting in today, but the costs in the future. If we don't spend this money, it's absolute the worst kind of short-termism to fail to invest in children's education and to let a whole generation of children catch up. That will damage the British economy in the future by hundreds of billions of pounds if we don't make this investment now. So by failing to do this, we will actually make the economy slow down, hold the economy back. And, the government like to talk about levelling up. They talk about it a lot, but we don't actually see very much evidence of it. But what could be more about levelling up than making sure every child gets the good education they need and deserve to succeed in life, and that, frankly, our country needs them to have if we want to succeed as an economy in the globalised economy that we see growing all around us.
All right, we're going to talk about the talks that have been ongoing over the Northern Ireland Protocol. Just before we leave the issue of education, what's actually happening this afternoon? Because Labour are obviously making a point about this whole idea on education and having a debate on it.
Yes, so they're doing an opposition day debate where they want to force the issue. And of course, this is something that they use their opposition days in order to try and put pressure on the government to come up with funding. And I think there's an issue here for Boris Johnson, because if you look back at the last couple of years, you'll remember free school meals, a huge row that he got into and ended up in a major spat with a top footballer and had to back down, not once, not twice, I think 3 times in the end. And then he's got pressure from his own backbenchers as well, people like Robert Halfon, who chairs the Select Committee, who are just saying that this has got to be a priority for the government, that they have to basically put their money where their mouth is. And that point there very much about children from disadvantaged backgrounds being the ones that are worst hit. is something that he's going to have to deal with, and I think will come up again and again, particularly from those MPs from those areas where they can see that happening to the children in their schools.
Now, talks have been ongoing between Lord Frost, the Brexit negotiator, and his EU counterpart, Maros Sefcovic. Now, the headline that's come out of it is there weren't any breakthroughs, there weren't any breakdowns either. You'll remember we talked about this in the first part of the programme, about the checks that are taking place on certain goods travelling from Great Britain into Northern Ireland. Terms that were signed up to the EU, say, by the UK. The UK government is saying it is all about the implementation of what is called the Northern Ireland Protocol. Let's hear what Lord David Frost said when he came out of the meeting that he was having with his EU counterpart about the issue of chilled meats. There is a deadline looming at the end of June, which could potentially ban the export of what the papers are called sausages from GB to NI. Let's hear what he had to say.
Obviously, we did discuss that subject amongst many others today. There weren't any breakthroughs on it. We continue to consider all our options on that and many other issues. The situation in Northern Ireland is a sensitive one, and the protocol is delicately balanced to support it. We don't see what risk is caused to Northern Ireland if chilled meats are imported there from GB.
Robin, we heard the Prime Minister in Prime Minister's Questions saying that David Frost, who we just heard there, is doing a marvellous job. How's that when there's been no breakthrough at all and the stalemate continues?
Well, I think we all want to see progress on these issues, and I think it's incumbent on both the UK and the EU to work together to find pragmatic solutions here, to do what the protocol was intended to do, which is to have no impact on the everyday life of people in Ireland and Northern Ireland. And in that respect, what's clear is that some of the ways in which the EU has interpreted the protocol and is insisting on checks are having an impact on people, having an impact on the food that's available for consumers and the prices. And those are things that, I think we are both committed to address. I want to see breakthroughs on this. I was surprised to hear Maros Sefcovic saying this morning he wanted no quick fixes, because actually I think what businesses and what people in Northern Ireland are telling us is that they want to see progress on this fast. And certainly the expectation when the protocol was signed and agreed to was that the Joint Committee, which we're meeting today, would be able to address these issues and would be able to look at these things in order to find solutions that work to respect the internal market of the UK, whilst also understanding the EU's concerns about protecting their own single market.
Right, Steve, you signed up, like most MPs, to this deal. So can you understand where the government is coming from, that perhaps it's up to the EU to be more flexible in their interpretation?
Clear, we only voted for this deal because at that point the government had run out of road and the only alternative was no deal, which would have been even worse than the dreadful deal the government negotiated.
So what would
you
change?
And we made clear our concerns about it at that point. But the thing to remember is it was the Prime Minister who negotiated this deal. It was the Prime Minister who signed this deal. And at that point, he said there would be no need for a border down the Irish Sea. In fact, I seem to recall him saying that if anybody tried to make a business fill in customs forms to transport goods from Great Britain to Northern Ireland, they should bring the forms to him and he would rip them up. Well, the reality, of course, as always with this Prime Minister, has collided with the rhetoric, and he's been found out for making promises he couldn't keep. Now, the government's been telling us they didn't realise there was going to be this problem. Very interesting then, wasn't it? I think just earlier today or last night that we heard Gavin Barwell, the former Conservative Prime Minister's Chief of Staff, saying that there's no way that civil servants would not have told the government this was going to be a problem. So the government really just covered it up and ploughed on regardless, and has just allowed this problem to arise. And as a result of it, Take back control, which was the slogan of Brexit, now means that businesses cannot freely transport goods from one part of the United Kingdom to another part of the United Kingdom. It's not a very good form of taking back control to me. Now, there will be ways to deal with this. It was encouraging to hear Robin sounding reasonably pragmatic about that just then. But we really do need to sit back down, both sides around the table, and find a way around this, because you cannot have a situation where you cannot export or transport goods from one part of a country to another part of the same country.
So, Robin, did you not realise, like David Frost said, the impact that was going to happen on goods travelling from Great Britain to Northern Ireland, or you did realise and you just thought you'd wriggle out of it?
No, what was set out in the agreement is that both sides would use their best endeavours to support the movement of goods within the UK internal market and also within the the EU internal market, and that there would be work through the Joint Committee to resolve any issues. I think what's really important now is we need to make sure that that work can come to fruition. We do need solutions, as Lord Frost has been saying. We need to recognise there's a real degree of concern on the ground in Northern Ireland amongst ordinary people who just want to be able to go about their lives unaffected by this process. We have done absolutely what is necessary to respect our commitments under the protocol, to avoid barriers between Ireland and Northern Ireland and to protect the peace process, and we will continue to do that. But what we need to ensure as well is that the wording in the protocol about the everyday lives of people in Northern Ireland, the wording in the protocol about respecting East-West links and Northern Ireland's position in the United Kingdom is also delivered on and followed through. And that is where I think we need to see movement from the EU.
Right. I mean, time is of the essence, isn't it, Vicky, because of this deadline at the end of June. Do you think there will be a breakthrough?
I mean, there's various deadlines coming, actually. So there was the one on meat, there's others on medicine for later in the year, and they do feel that as being, you know, even more urgent. But I think what is interesting here is that the EU feel that really the situation that Northern Ireland, the status they were given, was already sort of changing the rules that had ever been given to any other country. So they feel the EU, they've already compromised. And what's interesting, listening to David Frost and others and the Prime Minister, they keep talking about the EU's got to be more pragmatic, accusing them of legal purism. I mean, the EU would say, well, we're enforcing the rules which you knew about, or you didn't realise what they were, and that's a problem for you too. And I think what you've seen here is this collision between Boris Johnson today talking about opportunities and optimism with Brexit. These are the realities.
That's all we have time for. Bye-bye.